Now, I shall enjoy telling you about the lives of elegant and exceptionally wealthy gentlemen like myself, who enjoyed the best of everything and generally lived to enjoy a port-sodden old age. And I'll be telling you what the other 94% of us who were downstairs were getting on with while they were living the life of Riley. And between us, you'll end up with a slightly better idea of what really went on upstairs and downstairs, and occasionally in my lady's chamber. Our part of the world's awash with wonder-filled country houses, but in this series I'll be looking less at the art and architecture and more at the rich folk in their castles and the poor folk at their gates. This week, the gates of Blickling Hall in Norfolk. In the peace and quiet of rural Norfolk, with RAF fighter planes going overhead, just off the equally busy B1149 up to Hull, is this rather elegant 1700s monument. So why is it here? Well, the inscription, it says HH, and that stands for Henry Hubbard, or Henry Hobart if you see it written down. The Hubbards were a great family hereabouts over 300 years ago, and this stone commemorates a calamitous event in their history. The morning in August when Henry Hubbard fought a duel on Corston Heath. The duel took place between Mr. Henry Hubbard and his near neighbour and arch political rival, Mr. Oliver Leneve. Oh no, it won't blow off, they said, it'll be all right. No one ever listens to me. Now, shall we remove our wigs, gentlemen? This is where the expression coming at it bald-headed comes from. Now, on guard, sir. Commence. And as some of you English dueling aficionados will have already noted, Mr. Leneve is in fact leading with the wrong hand because he was a celebrated southpaw, a left-hander. A fact judging by the face on Mr. Hubbard, which was unknown to him prior to this fight. Unfortunately, this was one of those occasions when the right hand really didn't know what the left hand was doing. Ooh, that's got to hurt. It was a cruel blow. Hey, look, I know we've been joking about the duel and everything, but it was a very serious affair. Henry Hubbard was hustled off the heath by his friends and his seconds, sorely stricken, mortally wounded. He spent, as Charles II said of his own death, an unconscionable time a-dying. He was a day and a night shuffling off his mortal coil in this very bedroom, the West Turret bedroom, in one of the great houses of the region, Blickling Hall. For me, the exterior of Blickling Hall is a perfect, pleasing blend of blush pinks, Dutch gables and stone mullions. None of your grandiose Italianate nonsense here, all columns and cornices. Oh no, Blickling's English, it's domestic, and believe me, it's a sight for sore eyes. As you might expect though, its interior's a tad more flashy. You see, these places weren't built just to entertain and impress your family and friends. They were aimed at your political and economic allies. At this very table, you wined, dined and discreetly manipulated all those people into helping the Hubbards climb ever higher through society. And from the middle 1500s, right up to the eve of the Civil War in the 1600s, they used to make their way up to the roof, though not, I suspect, along narrow stairs like that. I mean, let's face it, I'm having difficulty. Can you imagine what it would be like with a big iron farthingale to hold out your skirt? I think not. You see, we use the word banquet to describe a very large feast, but back then, they used the word in a much more specific way. They used it to describe a very small part of a big feast. A very small but very important part. The pudding. Lead me to it. You see, here at Blickling, they built no less than 4 banquet chambers, each one sited right at the top of the roof in the corner turrets. And when the guests came up, they would find in the middle of the room wenches with trays of sweet... Come on, girls. You're supposed to be here, I said. I need you up in the middle. Just instead, you stand there discussing your motivation and stuffing yourself with march pairing. Come on, don't eat the props. Come on, you know that. Like, in the middle. OK, look, back to back. Yeah, that's it. Actresses, God. The thing is, you come up, and if you had a special guest, then you would create a little confectionery that was meant to cause him to smile and make him feel special. So I'd like to think that, that Ellen here had made these, because she made them last night, had made these specially for me because I'm such a star. But in actual fact, you're probably thinking it's the Earl of Oxford, isn't it? Because the Earl of Oxford's symbol was a star. And this is what they'd do if he was coming. This is what they'd do. You see, all this was a little bit of, thanks girls, all this was a little bit of extra fun at the end of a really convivial meal. And of course, people didn't just come up here to, you know, feed their face. They came up to enjoy the view. This was a great opportunity for the lord of the house to show off the extent of his domain. Really sort of pleasant way to finish off a wonderful dinner. And of course, dinner was at lunchtime, so it's a nice way to spend the afternoon drifting into the evening and supper time. When Henry Hubbard fell foul of Mr. Lenev's sword on Corston Heath, the hall ended up falling foul of the moneylenders. It was his son who eventually repaired the hole in the family finances by making moves to marry into money. At the same time, his sister, Henrietta, who was the mistress of King George II, was making certain moves all of her own to persuade HRH to make her brother an earl. Luckily, her passionate affair with German Geordie still left her with sufficient stamina to supervise the restyling of her brother's house. In carrying through her grand design for Blickling, Henrietta displayed a capacity for spending like a scouser on a spree. This is perhaps one of the great glories of her work. This is the Chinese bedroom. And in some ways, she was a fashion leader. She was 30, 40 years ahead of the great fashion for chinoiserie. It just is an absolutely astonishing work of art. And from this beautiful apartment, they would pass, the lady of the house, that is, would pass into the dressing room. Now, when they came in here in the morning, they didn't come in here to get dressed. They came in here to be dressed. Because one of the defining characteristics of people of gentle birth was that they did no work. They did no work for themselves, which could be as easily or more conveniently done by a servant. So the whole business of buttoning up an elaborate dress or bodice was done by a maidservant. And the hair and the jewellery, it was all done for you. And where did all these servants come from? Well, they certainly didn't pass to and fro in the main apartments. They came from secretive little doors like this that gave onto a far less sumptuous, far less elegant... What? Idling? On the money I pay you every year? Away, you slovenly, sluttish slattons! I thought I was going to trip on all those S's. Anyway, the thing is, we are about as far away now from these painted Chinese rooms as Blickling is from Peking. This is a very different world, a world of bare floorboards and stairways, of bleak, empty walls. And yet, for all that it was bleak and empty, there were occasions when it wasn't beneath the master's dignity to step down into this world in order to satisfy his more basic instincts. There was a famous occasion when the Earl of Berkeley managed to persuade an 18-year-old in service at his house that they'd actually gone through a form of marriage. In fact, she must have been incredibly naive, because while the Earl was busily pulling the wool over her eyes, at the same time as he was pulling the hem of her skirt over her knees, she'd borne him 7 children. Of course, the Earl was forced to make an honest woman of her, but he did it very ungraciously, and society never forgave this, in their opinion, upstart woman. Although she was now the Duchess, she was ostracised from society, and just to drive the point home, her eldest son, the son and heir of the Earl, was never recognised and had the title taken away from him. At Blickling, the second Earl suffered agonising symptoms of a severe gout, and desperate to ease the appalling pain he was in, he was persuaded to plunge his throbbing part into a bucket of iced water. Well, the pain ceased immediately, because the poor dear man suffered a massive and fatal heart attack. How sad. So the Georgian heyday of Blickling Hall was all but over, but the history hasn't come to an end. After the break, I'll be taking you off this well-trodden tourist trail and taking you on the road less travelled, the one that takes us up into the hidden history of Blickling Hall. Bryan's upstairs and downstairs. An irreverent, historical charabang trip to those stories that generally don't make it into the guidebooks of our stately homes. We're at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, which was built by the Hub family back in the 1620s, but it was inherited in the 1800s by the Lothian family. Now William, the 8th Marquess of Lothian, made his money designing bizarre beards for Victorian women. You can see him modelling one here. And his wife Constance spent all that money on rebuilding parts of the hall to house the huge staff that they employed there. She packed all the very latest and best facilities into block. There was a new kitchen, there were a brewery, I left my own hut. All the facilities were here, readily available to provide the very best in gracious living. Unfortunately for Constance, in an excess of enthusiasm, she'd somewhat overlooked the ergonomics of domestic economy. Take the rest of the afternoon off. Ooh, there's lovely. You see, the kitchens were a little bit of a hike from the dining room, which meant that what started off very steamy, unlike the maid, I'm glad to say, very quickly went off the boil. You see, the problem was, despite all these bang up to the minute facilities, the kitchen had been sited in the medieval manner. It was about 147 3/4 miles away from the dining room. 2.5 days later, you arrived at the servery outside the dining room. Don't worry, I'll be all right this evening. Of course, they did actually have braziers and other appliances for reheating some of the food, but come on, reheated or cold, it can't have been appetising.
Mistress says it's cold. Better take it back.
Bloody water rain. I'm going to join one of them unions, I reckon. Actually, they did get some things right, though. You will observe when I close this door that there isn't actually a handle on it to get you out of the dining room back into the servery. So how did you come out with a tray full of dirty dishes? Very simple. In a masterpiece of ergonomic design, you were encouraged to stand in the corner and apply pressure with your left foot to that rather elegant brass stud set into the floor, and as the door swung open, you eased it through with your foot, and out you went. And as one emerges from the servery, one enters the dining room. I'm beginning to sound like a bus tour guide, aren't I? It's beautiful, isn't it? It's made to look like a Jacobean dining room. Jacobean is James I, from Jacobus, which is Latin for James. So this is a wonderful sort of recreation of a dining room of that period. And it's all in oak and chestnut panelling. When visitors tour around Blickling, they come here to the long gallery, and they all stand craning their necks to look at the plaster masterwork of this early 1600s coffered ceiling. But I've often wondered how many of them realise what's beyond it. It's the plain, unadorned workaday world of the servants' quarters. Can you imagine it? After 12 and on a bad day even 16 hours of fairly hard labour, depending on the job you've got, you drag yourself up those stairs to come to sleep in one of these rooms. Three or four in a room sometimes, unless you're one of the upper servants. I mean, you can almost hear it, can't you? Just if you just stop and listen in these narrow, cramped, crowded corridors, dust-filled, and well, I can hear the distant voices of these still lives that were lived out in these rooms and on these corridors by a whole underclass of people who made these buildings function. And I can't help but wish that we could somehow do more to lift the dust covers off their lives, because they've all but vanished from view. They're kept hidden in a way. I wonder whose room this was. Obviously someone fairly important, because they've got a fireplace and it's a fairly sizable room with a big window. So they weren't going to be as cold as some of the junior servants. But you know, look, even that privilege, if you like, carried certain responsibilities. Just when you come up here late in the evening, you'd settled yourself into bed, maybe just blown the candle out, and then the bell goes off. You know, what is it? Are you the nanny? Maybe the kids have wet the bed. Mum and Dad ain't going to do that. That's going to be your job. So you get, light the flint, light the candle, all the way back down the corridors again. You know, it's a life, it's a world that we've lost. And I suspect most of those below stairs, well, few of them would mourn what's been lost. But clearly for some servants, it was a life that very definitely had its moments. Illicit relationships between the masters and the girl servants were all too common, sadly. It was sort of given the nod, I suppose. But of course, in a patriarchal and hierarchical society, the men who ran it took a very, very dim view of the mistress of the house, who decided that what was sauce for the goose was sauce for the gander. Ooh. Oh, Diana, not eggs and port again.
Keep your strength up, Jones. I'll be requiring your services later.
Eggs and port, I should point out, as was considered a wonderful specific for those who were intent upon prolonged engagement in the amorous arts of beautiful Venus. Well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. Oh, tastes dire, but all I can say is she's well worth it. The wealthy Diana Dormer took up with one of her footmen called Jones and scandalised the entire society that she lived in. Her maidservant was so outraged that she told her in no uncertain terms, "You are not fit to be my lady," and stomped off to take service in a more puritanical household. Now, when Mr. Dormer discovered what was going on, he duly divorced his wife, and all his servants trooped into court to give evidence as to the nature of the affair. Of course, you have to remember that they were probably being leaned on quite heavily by their boss, but clearly they'd been scandalised in their own little way as well, because the thing that they all took appalling exception to was that Jones had begun to give himself airs and graces, that he was no longer one of them, putting over one on the bosses. He'd actually begun to take it all terribly seriously, so much so that he'd actually stopped using the back stairs where the servants went and could be seen disporting himself up and down the Lord's staircase. At Blickling, the old order continued. The servants served the masters just as they always had, until eventually the whole system was overtaken and overturned by world events. In 1940, the RAF arrived and the hall became the officers' mess. By then the servants had gone, but the housekeeper, Miss O'Sullivan, stayed on to keep an eye on them. Now, at the end of this corridor was Miss O'Sullivan's bedroom. And just out here above me was the big board that had all the servants' bells on. And in the early hours of the morning, when the boys in blue were finally kicked out of the Buckinghamshire Arms next door, they'd sway and stagger and swerve their way back somehow to their billet. Except that it was considered jolly good japes to creep silently and stealthily, or as silently and stealthily as a drunk can creep, and get up here and go bang, 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 ah, ha, 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 and run away. Poor Mrs. Sullivan. Play nice, lads. Of course, the war, in that savage, irrevocable way that war has, changed everything. In 1931, by far the vast majority of women in jobs were in domestic service. By 1946, when the war was over, most of them never went back to domestic service. And if you can't get the staff to service these places, what are you going to do? Well, a lot of people who owned houses like this simply shut them down. Next time, I'll be partying with England's first Prime Minister at Houghton Hall in Norfolk, where I'll try to solve the mystery of what happened to the missing staircase and discover just what the captain was peeping at.